picture this. You're driving down the road in your manual vehicle. You notice that when you shift into fourth gear, it doesn't seem to want to accelerate. The RPMs are rising, and you notice a burning smell. Well, I'm going to show you how to replace a clutch, backyard style. The first step is to get the vehicle up on some ramps, and then block off the back wheels so it doesn't roll backwards. Now disconnect the battery, drain both the transfer case and the transmission fluid. Now removing the drive shaft, I used a 12mm 12-point wrench to get those bolts off. And also another thing to note is that the front drive shaft has a yoke, so you can easily slip it out of the transfer case. For the other end of the drive shaft, I used a 3/16 hex to get those bolts off carefully. The next step now was to disconnect the shifter linkage from the transmission to the transfer case, carefully without breaking any pieces. So I went into the top of the cab and started removing the boot and the shifter from the transmission. So once I got the shifter out, I decided to put a bag over it to make sure no debris would enter. Now it's time to disconnect anything that's attached to the transmission. So disconnect the slave cylinder line, some of the electrical connectors such as the reverse light switch. Also disconnect the speedometer cable as well, and remove the starter. So the way to disconnect this hydraulic line is you have to press this plastic piece in and it's going to release it, which will allow you to pull it out. Remove the skid plate that's underneath the transfer case, then find a jack to support it. Now the final object to unplug is the indicator light on the transfer case. Unfortunately mine was already damaged, but make sure you get to yours though. Now all you have to do is just loosen the 5 bolts that hold the transfer case on the back of the transmission, and it should come right out with a little wiggle room. Moving on to the next issue that I had was I didn't have a regular transmission jack. Taking my regular 2-ton floor jack, I took the contact piece off and put a wheel on and fastened it down. Now I got a better jack with more surface area. Here comes one of the fun parts, removing the bell housing bolts. So for the top 2, what I did was, on the driver's side, I was able to get a long extension and get that bolt. However, on the passenger side, due to my catalytic converter being in the way, I had to reach in through the engine bay. And luckily, if you unplug the distributor wire, you can get your wrench in there and break it loose. And then you might have to use your fingers to loosen it all the way out. For this transmission, there were 6 bolts holding it to the engine block. And also something else to consider is removing the exhaust, which would help give you more clearance. Now once you have all those bolts out and your transmission is supported on the jack, you can remove the cross member. And you should also be able to get to that exhaust mounting bracket. Now as you're getting ready to lower it, I recommend you having a second spotter on standby. But luckily I was able to lower the jack down with the ramp that I had. Now it is time to remove the clutch. So the way I removed the clutch was I loosened up the bolts for the pressure plate, and the clutch disc just comes right out. And now for the flywheel, what I did was I put one of the clutch bolts back in, then used a wrench and used one of the bell housing bolts, and I was able to prevent the flywheel from turning, and I was able to loosen up the 6 flywheel bolts. With the flywheel off now would be a great time to replace the rear main seal and the oil pan gasket as well. What I worked on next was the slave cylinder. So the slave cylinder is on the transmission, and it's held in by 2 10mm bolts. I was able to get one out, but unfortunately, I was struggling to get the second one out. It got stripped and I had to use a specialized socket to get it out. These sockets are made for getting stripped bolts out. Looking at my oxygen sensor, I discovered something very interesting. The wires are nearly melted, and yet the oxygen sensor has not triggered any check engine code, and the vehicle seems to still run fine, but it is still worth replacing. Alright, continuing where we left off at, I got a new slave cylinder, and also new bolts to go with that, since I stripped the old ones, unfortunately. So I replaced the rear main seal, making sure it goes in flush, and I installed a new pilot bearing in our new flywheel. I just put a little bit of grease around the hole, make sure you get the right socket, and you just tap it in, So put the flywheel on and make sure to torque it down to 85 foot-pounds. Now we use our alignment tool, we put the friction disc on, and then the pressure plate. And for the pressure plate, we torque it down to around 25 foot-pounds, making sure that we do all this in a crisscross pattern. And before putting the transmission in, now is a good time to consider putting some silicone on the detent screw, which basically goes to a ball and spring and holds the shifter rail into place. So now it's time to slowly raise the transmission up and make sure, if needed, get a second person to help spot you. The tricky part now is lining up the splines on the input shaft carefully, and make sure that all the weight and pressure is not on the input shaft, because you don't want that to snap. Everything else from here is the opposite procedure of taking it out. And a few important things to note is this transmission, the FM146, does not take automatic transmission fluid or any ATF fluid. It takes gear oil, specifically a GL4 rated fluid. The transfer case on this transmission does take ATF fluid, so make sure you don't get those mixed up. And always check your owner's manual too. And when you have the clutch, the pressure plate, and the flywheel off, I recommend taking a look at the freeze plugs and make sure they're not all rusted. And also you might want to consider replacing the seal that's between the transfer case and transmission. But yeah, you can do this at home with the right tools. But anyways guys, hopefully this video was more in detail compared to my last one. Thank you guys for watching.